Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, thanks so much for that great introduction. And I'm very much looking forward to talking with you tonight. It's my pleasure to explore this topic of what science and prayer for healing might have to say to one another. And as we do this tonight, I'd like to look at 5 questions. First of all, well, why are people interested in miraculous healing? Second, what does the Bible have to say about healing? Third, can and should healing claims be tested empirically? 4, what does empirical research reveal? And 5, which empirical methods should be used? So let's just jump in and begin with that first question. Why are people interested in miraculous healing? When sickness strikes, people around the world pray for healing. Many claim that prayer has cured them from deafness, blindness, and metastasizing cancers, and some believe that they have been resurrected from the dead. Public opinion polls show that 82% of Americans believe in the healing power of personal prayer, and 64% think that doctors should pray with those patients who request it. Even more striking is that 73% of U.S. medical doctors say that miraculous healing occurs today. Secularization theory predicted that the rise of science would bring about the decline of religious healing. Well, this hasn't happened because even with the best medical care, people continue to suffer from lifelong debilitating conditions and to die from disease. But people are not choosing between medical treatment and prayers for miraculous healing, but rather combining them. As one observer aptly put it, Americans want it all, access to both MRIs and miracles. 23% of Americans are Pentecostal or charismatic Christians, most of whom claim to have personally experienced divine healing. Globally, there are now 2 billion Christians, 500 million of whom are Pentecostal or charismatic. Globalization heightens both the actual threat and the fear of disease, fueling the growth of religious movements that emphasize healing. In the developing world, 80% of the population lacks even basic medical care. For suffering people, any, quote, true God not only saves people for the afterlife, but helps people now. In the countries where Pentecostalism is growing the most rapidly, as many as 90% of first-generation Christians attribute their conversions primarily to miraculous healing. Christians combine evangelism with prayer for healing based on biblical models, and so let's ask, what does the Bible have to say about healing? Christians interpret Isaiah 53 as prophesying Jesus' atoning death and resurrection. According to many Pentecostals, through the atonement, God provided for forgiveness from sins and also for healing of diseases, since with his stripes we are healed. Isaiah is referenced by Matthew. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to Jesus, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. Whenever Jesus preached, he also healed in order to demonstrate the nature of the kingdom of God. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. And so Jesus healed not only to prove who he was, but because of his compassion for suffering people. Jesus' commissioning of his disciples is described in Mark. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. Corinthians lists the gifts of the Holy Spirit, including healings and miracles. James gives instructions for church practice. Is any sick among you? Pray for him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord, and the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Greek word sozo appears 110 times in the New Testament and is translated as save, heal, or deliver. Pentecostals argue that this implies a connection among spiritual salvation, physical healing, and deliverance from demonic oppression. But can and should healing claims be tested empirically? A number of scientists say no, concerned that empirical studies of prayer may be misused to advance religious agendas. And some religious practitioners agree with this restraint, worrying that scientific testing could undermine faith. I argue that if prayer affects health, for better or for worse, for natural or for supernatural reasons, then patients, doctors, and policymakers should all want to know. Worries about testing prayer are often framed in terms of a perceived conflict between science and religion. Historical research reveals a different context. Disputes over the efficacy of prayer for healing actually began as a Catholic Protestant controversy during the 16th century Reformation. Protestants insisted that they did not need miracles, while Catholics recruited medical doctors in order to confirm their miracles. During the 19th century, a skeptical physicist, John Tyndall, challenged Christians to compare the outcomes of patients who did and did not receive prayer in what became known as the prayer gauge controversy. Christians refused the challenge because they were afraid that prayer was being subjected to a test it could not pass. But over time, a fascinating cultural reversal took place. As 20th century studies began to report therapeutic benefits from prayer, scientific naturalists stopped calling for prayer studies and started to oppose them, worrying that empirical investigations might lend credibility to supernatural claims and erode the cultural authority of modern science. It was in this context that Harvard's Stephen Jay Gould introduced his non-overlapping magisteria, or NOMA thesis, in 1997. According to NOMA, the net of science covers the empirical universe, what it is made of, fact, and why does it work this way, theory. The net of religion extends over questions of moral meaning and value. These two magisteria do not overlap. But Gould also affirmed that NOMA permits, indeed enjoins, the prospect of respectful discourse, of constant input from both magisteria toward the common goal of wisdom. And yet, NOMA is often construed to imply that all scientific study of empirical effects of religious practices is off limits, and all theological inquiry is irrelevant to the practice of science. I draw the magisterial boundary between science and religion, such that empirical questions are valid topics for empirical study. But the magisterial boundary that needs to be respected is the interpretation of what empirical findings mean for matters of religion. It is an empirical question whether prayer for healing produces empirical effects that are therapeutically beneficial or harmful. Theological understanding is essential to designing studies that have both construct validity and ecological validity. In other words, studies that isolate the intended phenomenon of study and examine it as it naturally occurs. But scientific studies of religious practices cannot prove the existence or the non-existence of the divine or superhuman, or whether such an entity answers prayer. A revealing exchange published in Science magazine in 2011 illustrates the elusiveness of scientific proof. The editors published a news report titled, "At Long Last, Gravity Probe B Satellite Proves Einstein Right." A letter to the editor objected to this title misstep because, quote, "science doesn't prove theories. Scientific measurements can only disprove theories or be consistent with them. Any theory that is consistent with measurements could be disproved by a future measurement." The editors responded with a one-line concession that the criticism was completely correct and we blew it. This is because scientific inquiry involves weighing relative probabilities, not proving that effects that appear to exist are not merely the product of chance. Although science cannot prove the healing power of prayer, empirical studies can offer valuable information. Well, what does the empirical research reveal? Scientific research has returned mixed results. Some studies conclude that prayer improves health, while others show no effect, or suggest that prayer may lead to worsening health. One of the best-known studies, conducted by Harvard's Herbert Benson, reached the troubling conclusion that people who knew they were the objects of special prayer actually fared worse presumably because of anxiety that their condition seemed bad enough to warrant prayer. In assessing Benson's conclusion, it is important to note that the only Protestant intercessors who were enrolled in the study belonged to the Unity School of Christianity. Unity leaders have long denied that prayer works miracles and have called petitionary prayer useless. Rather than understanding prayer as supplication to a personal deity outside the self, many Unity practitioners envision prayer as affirmative thoughts and words. This is a very different idea of prayer than that held by many other Christians. Benson's results do not say anything about whether or not the prayer methods that are used by Protestant born-again or Pentecostal Christians are effective. An additional source of confusion is that the focus by all of these researchers has been on distant intercessory prayer. Intercessors are given the first name of and the condition of someone that they do not know and told to pray. Researchers set up double-blinded trials and base their conclusions solely on whether subjects in the experimental group exhibit better health than those in the control group. Yet, when many Christians pray for healing in real-life contexts, they get up close to someone they know, they touch the person and empathize with their sufferings, what I call proximal intercessory prayer, or PIP. Double-blinded controlled trials are not the only or even the best way to gauge the effects of this kind of prayer practice. Well, then which empirical methods should be used? I'd like to draw a modern analogy to explain my approach. The Hubble Space Telescope takes revealing pictures by using several different types of cameras. Often, researchers use one type of data or method to answer questions about prayer, some of which could be better answered using a different kind of data or analysis. I've spent the past 8 years studying PIP by Pentecostal and Charismatic Christians in the United States, Canada, Brazil, and Mozambique. I've used multiple methods or cameras, each one suited to answering a different question. When viewed together, the combination of vantages offers a more complete picture of the experiences and effects of healing prayer than could be provided by any single lens. Before describing these cameras, allow me to introduce the groups that I've studied. In the US, I've observed a variety of healing practices. Most people associate prayer for healing with flamboyant faith healers like Benny Hinn or parodies like the Steve Martin movie Leap of Faith. What I've found is that prayer for healing is usually much less dramatic and is practiced by ordinary Christians, often in such mundane spaces as hospitals and secular business parking lots. I've also looked at large healing conferences, especially those that grew out of revivals that were dubbed the Toronto Blessing. 3 million people from a wide range of churches visited Toronto in the 1990s, and many claimed that when they returned home, they brought the revival fires with them. Randy Clark was the guest preacher whose visit catalyzed the Toronto Blessing. Clark went on to found a missions organization called Global Awakening in order to spread the revival worldwide. Today, Global Awakening is active in 36 countries on every continent. Here, Randy Clark and Global Awakening are praying for pastors at a conference in India. This is a Global Awakening Stadium campaign in which Brazilian translators are working with lay North American Christians who traveled along with Global Awakening to serve as the prayer team. And here Global Awakening is working with a smaller church in Brazil. One pilgrim to the Toronto Blessing was a self-described burned-out American missionary to Mozambique, Heidi Baker. Today, Heidi and her husband Roland's organization, Iris Ministries, is active in 25 countries. They claim to have planted 8,000 churches in predominantly Muslim areas and to provide food daily for 10,000 orphan children. The Bakers insist that miraculous healings and resurrections from the dead are responsible. This is a typical mud hut village in rural Mozambique, where I had a chance to visit and do some research. Iris Ministries typically will gather a crowd by playing music and showing the Jesus film, after which Heidi Baker or another evangelist will invite the deaf and the blind up to the front, promising that Jesus will heal them. And this is a simple medical clinic at which the staff both dispense drugs and pray for healing. So which kinds of empirical methods should we use to study this type of prayer practice? first camera, medical records, can be used to ask the question, are healing claims documented? Surveys allow us to ask, how do sufferers perceive healing prayer? Clinical trials, can health outcomes of prayer be measured? And follow-up, do healing experiences produce lasting effects? Let's begin with camera one, medical records. Are healing claims documented? This list suggests some of the kinds of conditions for which informants have presented before and after medical records. Comparison of medical records from before and after prayer provides a check on whether people claiming healing exhibited improvements for which there is no obvious medical or natural explanation. Medical documentation cannot prove that prayer accounts for the recovery or that a divine or superhuman agent is responsible, or even that a condition has been permanently cured. Well, let's take an example. In the course of my research, I met Daisy, who claims to have worn hearing aids for the past 30 years. She was diagnosed with a progressively worsening hereditary inner ear problem. In 1999, tests showed moderate hearing loss. By 2004, Daisy's hearing loss was moderately severe to severe. Here we see the right ear is the O and the left ear is the X, and the further down on the chart you go, the worse the hearing level. And we can see the speech recognition thresholds on the bottom of 60 for both the right and the left ear. So those are the 2004 numbers on the left of your screen. In 2008, Daisy received PIP and, quote, felt my fingers on fire and the warmth of the Holy Spirit inside of me, after which she could reportedly hear without her hearing aids. She had her hearing retested 2 weeks later, showing normal thresholds in the higher frequencies with moderate loss in the lower frequencies, all of which range is still higher up, therefore better than the 2004 readings, and we can see speech recognition thresholds of 25 and 15. A screening conducted in 2010 showed that she still had normal hearing in the speech frequencies. Medical records do not prove that God healed Daisy through prayer, but they do confirm Daisy's claim of improved hearing. Medical records are sometimes presented to support resurrection claims. Mahesh Shabda, born in Kenya of Indian descent, is a healing evangelist who works in the same Pentecostal networks as Randy Clark and Heidi Baker. Shabda claims that when he was in Zaire, he had a word of knowledge or a divine revelation for someone whose son had died that morning. He prayed for a man whose 6-year-old son had been pronounced dead 8 hours before, after doctors had tried to revive him by administering an injection, sticking needles into his arms and chest, and by holding an open flame against his legs. At the time of prayer, the boy reportedly started moving in the arms of a relative. Now, there's no way to prove that the boy was really dead, but his family was sufficiently convinced that they all converted to Christianity and started a church. Shabda claims to have followed up 5 years later, and the boy was still fine. Shabda also claims that he fortuitously took a photograph of a 60-year-old blind Pakistani woman begging at an evangelistic service, shortly before the same woman recovered her sight. The woman on the right slide is shown testifying to her healing, saying that she saw a brilliant flash of light, and her vision was restored right after Shabda said, "Now, Lord Jesus, show these people that the message of the gospel is true." Heidi Baker, the Mozambique missionary, says that she has been miraculously healed of dyslexia, pneumonia, multiple sclerosis, and most recently, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. Baker says that in 2005, she was hospitalized in South Africa for 32 days on the strongest antibiotics available for MRSA. The doctors told her, "Write your tombstone." Given this encouraging prognosis, Baker decided to check herself out of the hospital to see a, quote, specialist in Toronto, by which she meant Jesus. She claims that she was healed while preaching. The Toronto Blessing Conference DVD shows that Baker appears to have gotten stronger by the end of her 2-hour-long sermon. Medical records confirm that Baker followed up 2 days later at a California hospital that specializes in the treatment of MRSA. The medical professionals who examined her were convinced that she had had MRSA, but that she no longer required hospitalization. Laboratory tests showed no evidence of remaining Staphylococcus bacteria. I also came across Frank, who attested that due to a shrapnel wound, he had been unable to read with his left eye for 24 years, until he received prayer. I asked Frank for his medical records, and he produced an optometrist note. It stated that on 02, the left eye uncorrected visual acuity was 2200. In 2007, it was now 2040. I followed up with Frank's optometrist, who revealed that the record had been altered. The phrases on 02 and now 2040 had been added. The unaltered record shows visual acuity of 2200 in 2007 after Frank's supposed healing. Such cases of apparent fraud do not seem to be common, but medical records are one way of sifting out which claims are less credible. Let's turn then to camera 2, surveys. How do sufferers perceive healing prayer? Surveys shed light on the perceptions of prayer recipients, but they cannot confirm the accuracy of perceptions. I analyzed surveys from 921 respondents from North America, Brazil, and Mozambique. 60% reported past healings. Even relatively minor healings seemed memorable. As for a British man who recalled, "I had muscle spasms in my upper back with pain about 35 years ago and was prayed over and received total healing in the mid-70s. 72% of respondents had a current need for healing of some physical problem. The most common complaint was pain. 37% of those needing healing claimed to experience improvement at the surveyed event. Most had previously received prayer for the same problem, perceiving the effects of repeated prayer to be cumulative. This was the case for a Brazilian woman who reported, "I fought with a reading problem from 2002 to 2004, and I was healed at a prayer marathon after being prayed for 49 times. 87% based their claims of healing on sensible improvements in symptoms, such as an 80% or greater reduction in pain or being able to do something that they couldn't do before. Relatively few respondents were merely claiming healing by faith. And those with high self-reported faith levels were no more likely to report healing than those who admitted to weak faith. Healing was attributed less to faith than to God's love and power. For instance, God's great love, the love of Christ for me. God met me and knows me. Jesus lives and heals. God's power, love." Camera 3, clinical trials. Can health outcomes of prayer be measured? I worked with a team of researchers to publish an article, a study of the therapeutic effects of proximal intercessory prayer, STEP, on auditory and visual impairments in rural Mozambique for the Southern Medical Journal in 2010. Our study design was to use an audiometer and vision charts to test hearing and vision thresholds before and after PIP. We prospectively recruited 24 consecutive Mozambican subjects, and even with such a small sample size, we found large enough effect sizes in individuals and consistent enough effects across the study populations in order to achieve statistical significance. For hearing, we found highly significant improvements post-PIP. 2 subjects had their thresholds reduced by over 50 decibels. And to give you a sense of the scale here, if you're standing right next to a motorcycle, that would be 100 decibels. Perfect hearing in a very quiet environment, that would be 0 decibels. We see on the left the reductions in thresholds. The blue is for the left ear, the red is for the right ear. And on the right-hand slide, we can see that the ambient noise changed quite little compared with the changes in hearing thresholds before and after PIP. For vision, we found significant improvements post-PIP. 3 subjects went from 2400, which is reading the top line of a vision chart, or worse, to 2080, which is relatively small print, or better. 1 subject went from being unable to count fingers from a foot away to being able to read the 2125 line of a vision chart. So here we have the changes in individual thresholds, and then on the right, we can see the statistical test that was used to determine significance. We also compared our results with studies of the effects of hypnosis and suggestion, and found that PIP resulted in greater average, and that's on the left, and greater maximum on the right, improvements in visual acuity. The comparison is useful because we would expect similar possible confounds with each of these interventions, such as the well-known placebo effect. We also were able to do a replication study in Brazil and found similar results. Camera 4 then, follow-up. Do healing experiences produce lasting effects? Many informants claimed that they were still healed as many as 8 years later. Often there is no way to verify such claims, but it may be possible to observe changes in demeanor or behavior, or to trace influences on others. A pattern emerged in the course of this research. Those who experienced healing prayed for others, who in turn reported healing, and then this new cohort prayed for still others, sometimes traveling to other countries in order to do so. Randy Clark believes that he was miraculously healed following a car accident at the age of 18. He recovered more quickly than the doctors expected, but there's no way to prove that God was responsible. But what we can do is trace the effects of this perceived divine healing on Clark and on other people he influenced. In a recent interview, Clark said that healing has been a huge thing in my life. I've always had a heart for ministry because I was almost killed at 18. And since '94, the year the Toronto Blessing began, the biggest sacrifice and the most painful thing I know is that in my experience as a father, I've lost half of my children's childhood because he spent so much time traveling around to healing conferences. Clark's emphasis on healing has influenced many others, such as Heidi Baker, who in turn influenced others, such as Francis, a South African man who was working with Baker when he was apparently beaten to death and put into a hospital morgue. Church members prayed for Francis, and he seemed to be raised from the dead. Upon reviving, Francis only had strength to say 2 words: "Forgive them." By the following morning, all of his wounds had healed. Francis went straight to the prison to secure the release of a captured assailant. This man became a Christian, attended Bible school, and went on to become a pastor. In one sense, it does not matter whether Francis was really dead or really resurrected. Francis believed that he had been murdered, and yet he forgave because he also believed that God had loved him enough to restore his life. After extending forgiveness, Francis quickly recovered his health. The assailant also believed that he was a murderer, and yet he had been forgiven by the man he killed, and this motivated him to change the direction of his life. George is an American man who, like Francis, believes that he was rescued from a death sentence. Diagnosed with an untreatable brain tumor, George received prayer at many Pentecostal conferences, including by Randy Clark and Mahesh Shabda. George, in turn, took other people to conferences and himself began praying for healing. For example, George took 14-year-old Mimi to a Shabda conference. Mimi was dramatically healed of asthma, after which she won a track scholarship to college. And she began to pray for her friends, a number of whom decided to become Christians. George also prayed for Donna, who had been suffering from chronic side pain for the past 10 years. She immediately experienced partial relief, which gave her encouragement to persevere in seeking additional prayer for the next 2 years. Donna's final healing was anticlimactic. She was not at the time seeking healing for herself, but had brought a friend who needed healing to a conference. A speaker had a word of knowledge for side pain. Donna stood up in response to the pain, noticed that the pain wasn't there anymore, and sat down without making any commotion and without anyone noticing that there was anything different about her. The conference DVD shows that the entire episode took about 5 seconds. Meanwhile, George, who is fluent in Spanish, traveled around Latin America as a healing evangelist. Antonio is a Nicaraguan pastor who was relieved of a toothache during one of George's conferences. As soon as Antonio experienced healing, he went to the hospital to pray for his mother, who was experiencing heart pains. The pain stopped, and she was released from the hospital. The next day, Antonio prayed for a member of his church, Giovanni, who was relieved of leg pain. Giovanni, in turn, prayed for his wife, who experienced relief from a throat tumor and was able to sing again. Giovanni also prayed for a woman and her baby who had a fever. Not only did the baby feel cooler after prayer, but the mother said that her broken toe had been healed during the prayer, even though Giovanni hadn't prayed for her toe. In this way, one healing experience often sets off chain reactions in which many people report miraculous healing. Such ripple effects of healing prayer largely account for the wildfire spread of global Pentecostalism. Today, I've explained why many people believe in miraculous healing and argued that we should use empirical methods to test for effects of prayer on health. Medical records, surveys, clinical trials, and follow-up are like 4 cameras. Bringing these complementary perspectives into focus produces a more complete picture than using any single study method. Can science prove the healing power of prayer? No. But empirical tests can illumine how prayer practices affect the health of individuals and fuel the global spread of Christianity. If you'd like more information on any of these subjects, my book, Testing Prayer, Science and Healing, is just about to be released from Harvard University Press, and Global Pentecostal and Charismatic Healing is available from Oxford University Press, and both are available through Amazon. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to conversation.
So the first question, Candy, is, so when you present your research to doctors and nurses, let's say practitioners, right, of health, how do they respond? And when you present it to people in the natural sciences, chemists, physicists, biologists, how do they respond? And especially given that you are in neither of those fields. I mean, religious studies is in the social sciences and humanities, right? So how does that work out? And what is the conversation like? Do you get pushback, challenge? What is it like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's been a lot of interest in the subject from both the medical community and the scientific research community, and generally a lot of quite favorable interaction. One of those very first figures that I gave you is that 73% of medical doctors believe that miraculous healing happens. And so for practitioners, I mean, these are people who are seeing a lot of sickness, a lot of suffering, and they don't have all of the answers. And they want whatever will be effective in helping their patients to get better. I mean, most doctors want their patients to recover. And so there's really an openness to trying to finding new methods to do this. And likewise, I mean, I think there are frameworks in some areas of scientific research where the term miracle just doesn't really make sense, right? And so there may be interest in the question, do people recover? But the idea of the supernatural, I mean, there's just not really a framework for that within the paradigm of scientific naturalism. Now, one of the arguments I'm making in this whole research is that the problem with a lot of the studies that have been done has been that there's been an absence of understanding of what religious practitioners are really doing. And so you get these distant intercessory prayer studies, you get unity as the kind of sample of Protestant prayer, and so you get results where they're really not studying what they think they're studying in the natural contexts. And here the phrases construct validity and ecological validity would be the research kind of language that would be used for this. And so I'm really making a case that you have to look at the theological and the religious dimension. And I haven't been doing this alone, right? I've been working with a team of biomedical researchers and physicians in this process. And it's that dialogue between religion and science that really needs to be the cutting edge of where we move. The question of, well, what about is this just some kind of placebo effect? Are there kind of psychological factors that may be involved? Are people just more credulous in other countries than in the U.S.? I mean, I think it's actually you're treading on thin ice to assume that people are more credulous outside of the United States than in the United States, right? I mean, it's easy to kind of like I don't think you can make that assumption, right? I think there are some really smart, really kind of aware people that you don't need formal education necessarily to kind of be aware of what's going on in your environment. So I don't think you can make that assumption. And that's partly why we do the comparison with things like hypnosis and suggestion studies, where we see that the effect sizes for PIP are actually much larger. Now, have we done research in the United States? Yes, we have. It is the case that fewer claims of miraculous healing are made in the United States than are made in other countries. And I think part of the answer to that is medical care is just assumed. It's actually really hard to find a blind or a deaf person in the United States to pray for, or even someone with uncorrected severe auditory or visual problems. Why? We wear glasses, right? We get hearing aids. Prayer is at most a second thought, even for those who kind of believe that healing exists. And so there's not the same aggressive searching after healing that there is in other countries often. And actually, things like blindness and deafness are actually a whole lot more common. Like 80 or 90% of those cases are in the developing world, and there are kind of climate and so forth reasons, nutritional reasons for that. So you've got a smaller pool in the U.S. But there are dramatic examples of hearing and vision and other conditions being proved in the U.S., tumors dissolving within 10 minutes. I mean, you saw the DAISY example of the hearing thresholds changing dramatically. And so there are cases in the U.S. I mean, actually, one of Heidi Baker's favorite stories to tell is of a British man who he had MS and he was paralyzed. I think he was quadriplegic even. And he kept a record of all the times that he had been prayed for. And it was something like 1,389. And he got healed on the 1,390th time, right? That kind of perseverance, right? That she thought it was bizarre that he kept a record of all the times he had been prayed for. But so yes, there are cases in the U.S. Do people usually seek miraculous healing only after they've sought medical help? In the U.S., I think that's the case. I think that's less common in other parts of the world where medical care is just a lot less available, a lot less reliable. Doctors who say a miracle has happened aren't really speaking as doctors, they're speaking as Christians, or they're speaking as believers in the spiritual. So it's very uncommon for even Christian doctors to use the language of miracle. How does Harvard feel about this research? Well, they are publishing my book, so I guess that's a good thing. And two Harvard professors who are writing endorsement blurbs for the book, so I guess that's pretty good too. We'll see what kind of heat they take for doing this. How do non-believer health professionals react and explain all these miracles? Well, it's placebo effect. We have to ask, what is placebo effect? And the answer is, we have no idea what placebo effect is. It's usually used as a label rather than an explanation. It just means that there's some kind of mind-body interaction that we don't understand. Well, even if it's a placebo effect, it's a pretty good one, right? To go from not being able to count fingers from a foot away to being able to read. That's a good placebo effect. I want to know more about that placebo effect, right? I mean, if it's placebo, let's investigate it, right? Let's try and get that to work. So that seems pretty good. That's my basic reaction. If it helps, let's find out more about it. Yeah, that's more of the same. More of the same. Is it a coincidence? Well, I mean, so maybe, right? I mean, it's just, this is where any one example tells you a little bit. It tells you about that person's experience. But it's when you add up a whole lot of examples. Yes, spontaneous remissions take place. But when in case after case of spontaneous remission, someone has a vision of Jesus, they feel sensations of an angel doing surgery on them. It's just, you add up enough of these coincidences, and it starts giving you a different picture. And this is why I think we need to use multiple lenses. Because any one gives you a little bit of information, but it builds a fuller kind of scenario for what's going on when you have multiple ones. Doesn't Jesus mention faith as part of why individuals are healed in the Bible? Yes, and I'm not saying that faith, I'm neither saying that faith has no role in healing or that practitioners say it has no role. The reason I mention faith versus God's love and power is because I think there's so much of an association of the faith healer, and especially a negative association where you think, oh, well, that's faith healing, it's anti-medical. And so my point here is to say that faith is perceived as one among a variety of factors as to why someone either would or would not be healed. But yes, I mean, it is seen as a factor. And this is partly where I define faith as perseverance in seeking after prayer rather than as expression of intellectual belief. Okay, how were the Mozambique study subjects selected? Basically, people like Heidi Baker and the Iris Ministry people, they ran their healing services the way that they do. And what that means is they give a general announcement to the entire kind of population, bring me your deaf and bring me your blind. And then anyone comes up, and these are predominantly Muslim villages with African traditional healing kind of mixed in with that. And so anyone could come up, and we took consecutive subjects. They were prospectively recruited, so they weren't hand-selected in any way. They were given information sheets about the study, and were given kind of translation options for whatever they wanted. I mean, none of them really wanted a whole lot of information. They wanted to be healed. And so, yes, we did inform them. We followed informed consent procedures for that. And this is an interesting question. Was there any incentive for subjects to be dishonest about their condition? And this is actually interesting because, if anything, they had an incentive to not come up for this kind of prayer because these were Muslim villages. It would be socially damaging for them to come to a Christian meeting. And actually, usually traditional healers charge more money if a person gets healed than if they're not healed. And so, if anything, they would want to minimize improvements because they might be afraid of being charged if they said that they improved. And have studies taken into consideration doctoring competence as well as psychosomatics of healing? Yeah, I mean, sure, there's misdiagnosis. And this is why it's important to look at a variety of cases, to have medical experts examine the cases. This is why we look at before and after medical records. And any one example is not going to be definitive, but it's the addition of one example after another, which again just gives you more information of what's going on. Can I explain and elaborate more about studies that show a negative effect of PIP? Here really the basic study is that Benson study that I mentioned, where people who knew they were the objects of prayer fared worse. And so it wasn't the prayer itself that was damaging, but it was the anxiety that was caused by the prayer. And anxiety is bad for blood pressure. And if you're looking at cardiac patients, that might not be a good thing. Have I looked into the book Heaven is for Real, where a father tells the story of his little boy's trip to heaven during surgery? Yeah, I've looked at that, and there's a whole genre of these books. There are a lot of accounts of people who claim that they've had heavenly visitations, and some of those are associated with healing, resurrections from the dead. There's actually a lot of accounts like that one. What is the strongest argument against the effectiveness of faith healing? I mean, really, I think the most common arguments are, well, what about failures, and isn't it just a placebo effect? And so, I mean, I think I've basically addressed both of those issues.
Maybe last two?
Well, I think we're to the last question. So the last question is that if we want to do good in the world and the possibility exists to be agents of supernatural healing, do we have a moral responsibility to explore if it's possible? And I do think that there are real ethical and moral reasons to not simply assume that healing doesn't take place. Right? There are suffering people around the world. 80% of them don't have any medical care. If there's a possibility to help people, I mean, whether it's a really good placebo effect or whether there are other effects that come into play, shouldn't we want to know how to help people? And is there something that we can learn from how prayer is practiced, whether or not it's in a religious context? So I think that definitely that there are public health, public policy, ethical reasons why it's essential that we at least investigate what the practices are that are being used for healing and look at the question of whether there might be clinical applications that eventually can be discovered. Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.